All right, welcome everybody to this live session of Pluralia Dialogos, where I'm very, very happy to be joined by Caleb Maupin, who has been a. Sorry, I was getting a little bit of a feedback there on my side. Sorry. Uh, so, Caleb, thank you for joining us today, and I'm still getting feedback. Sorry. Okay, now I think I resolved it. I resolved my issue. Big apologies. So, in today's session, we are going to be looking at a lot of the major battle points, the fractures, the fissures in the system, both the internal contradictions that have brought about this current global crisis, which is more than simply a crisis threatening war. It is also a systemic crisis, which has cultural ramifications, economic. All of this is tied into to one single process. And there are solutions, of course, which is why we're all on board and why we do these things, but without an appreciation for the arsonist, for the threats, for the short-sightedness, we are not going to be able to navigate through that minefield, which is why I've always been appreciative of Caleb Maupin, and as well, here is Carpentier, two gentlemen who have participated in these roundtable sessions in the past and who have a strong sense of solution orientation, especially around the idea of cooperation and dialogue between East and West cultures and civilizations, specifically animated by great projects, creativity. So, gentlemen, thank you both for coming on today's show. Links to both of your works and your websites will be in the description box under this video very shortly. Um, what we're going to do today is a little bit different from our previous four sessions, where both Com and Caleb have prepared some formal remarks, some considerations as a short briefing, 15 or so minutes each, regarding the major trigger points, the dangers, and the points of hope for today's world, things that people should be thinking about very seriously that's too often ignored in the mainstream media. And then we're going to shift gears for a bit of a dialogue, including the audience, who I hope, like usual, will throw in some good questions and thoughts that I can throw to our guest speakers for today. So, both, first of all, welcome to the show.
Sure.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
For the first part of today's segment, Com, I know you shared with me many considerations that you were thinking about chewing on. So why don't I just throw the ball at you? What should people be thinking about as most important, both on the domestic front inside of the United States, the battles for the good and for the bad, as well as on the global front?
Well, again, thank you. It's nice to see you, Matt, and it's nice to make the acquaintance long distance with Caleb Maupin, whom I have often seen on RT and on other channels, and whose analysis I always appreciated. So I will be as brief as can be, although there is a lot to be said. I will concentrate, therefore, on the seemingly most burning issues, at least in terms of the impact on the media that we are observing in the US and their impact abroad. And I will first recall that we are in a situation which is probably unprecedented in the US. I could say the world is also in an unprecedented situation, but in the US, we have a president who is now accusing directly his opponents and the former president to have attempted to assassinate him, to have plotted an assassination, and therefore to be potentially guilty of treason if found guilty. And on the other, we have an opposition, which is often labeled as the deep state, but which includes the Democratic Party and perhaps also certain members of the Republican Party, who are desperately, by all means, trying to block Trump's presidency by opposing many of his decisions. And I'm not going to say right away whether these decisions are good, bad, or sensible, or insane, because a lot is being said on both sides. Although we can observe a definite loss of balance and rationality on the part of the White House in many respects. And in particular, you can see the reaction to certain things, such as the letter printed by the Wall Street Journal, which is a birthday card from Trump to the late Epstein. And Trump immediately said it's not true and I'm suing them for 10 billion. Now, we know very well that this letter or this card is authentic. So for Trump to say that shows a complete lack of balance and reflection. But this is just a detail, which brings me to the general picture of what's happening in the US, which is that the state is in a process of collapse. And just as Trump would like to throw out the Federal Reserve Chairman and possibly become the Federal Reserve Chairman himself, or possibly even some say bringing down the Federal Reserve, which of course has been the subject of much polemic and of much criticism for many years now. And on the other hand, you have some serious challenges which are being raised about the authority of the president to do certain things that he is doing and that he has done, both with regard to foreign policy, such as the tariffs, and the fact that many of those decisions seem to be made on the basis of personal preferences and interests of the president. I'll give you an example. When he invited General Munir of Pakistan to the White House and gave him a lunch, which is rather, I would say, above protocol, but anyway, he basically wanted him to support his candidacy for the Nobel Peace Prize. And then what is less known is that he invited Prime Minister Modi, who was at the time in Canada, and asked him to come over, have lunch with him. And it was clear that he also wanted him to co-sponsor the nomination for the Nobel Prize, which Mr. Modi declined to do by claiming that he had some urgent engagements in India and couldn't possibly change his travel plans. But that shows you the extent of what I would call perhaps the alienation of the president, who basically thinks that the most important thing is for him to secure a Nobel Prize, and who is lobbying very actively about this. Now, this is just one of the many instances of things that have been done, which Trump's supporters have tried to justify and even praise, but they found and they find increasingly difficult a support of his policies when they clearly stray away from either rationality or sheer honesty. I will again go back to the issue of what's happening now with the so-called Epstein files. Let us not even discuss whether they are files or not. There is a dossier which the Attorney General has referred to very clearly, and now yet there has been, so far from the administration, a complete refusal to disclose the information which his own supporters, which Trump supporters in the MAGA field, would like to see opened up. And Trump has definitely lost his temper on this. He has accused some of his supporters of being disloyal and stupid. And he basically said, I don't want your support anymore. And then he took the attitude that MAGA is not a general agenda for the reform of America. It is basically unstinting loyalty to him. So he is MAGA, and whatever he does, MAGA supporters should back. Clearly, this has disheartened and infuriated a lot of his core supporters, including Marjorie Taylor Greene, including Tucker Carlson, including, I mean, I could go on citing names and powerful people in support of Trump generally so far, who feel that Trump has something to hide. And it's not difficult to understand that he has something to hide, because we know that the murkiest case in the last few years in American politics is the Epstein files. And we all see now what's happening with the only person to have been condemned and incarcerated, who is Miss Maxwell. And we see that Trump is probably now trying to negotiate some sort of a deal with her. We don't know what it is, but the long and the short of it is that Trump was very deeply involved on a personal level with Epstein. And the Epstein case is so fascinating. It reads like a crime thriller. And so it has been endlessly discussed and analyzed by people like Whitney Webb, like Ryan, like David. Yeah, I mean, I could go on giving names, but also David, he's the former lawyer of one of the victims. In any event, David, the fact is that there has been a tremendous number of analysts and researchers who have paid attention to this dossier and who have come with some rather, I would say, terrifying results, in the sense that no matter how you look at the Epstein affair, you can see that it has multiple dimensions. On the one hand, it is definitely a matter of very murky finance, high finance, involving money laundering and tax evasion, at the very least, also involving the famous derivative financial market, which, as you know, was mostly responsible for the 2007-2008 financial crisis, which collapsed Bear Stearns, where Epstein had worked for a while. So this is a financial dimension. There is no clarity about what Trump's role was in that. But then if you look at the political dimension, the fact that Epstein was on a very close terms with many of the most important people in the world for many years, despite what he was doing in his private life, which some of them at least must have known. And then it goes all the way from, Larry Summers to Bill Clinton, very intimate relationship. Also, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, who was not the Crown Prince yet. And then you go on, and you find hundreds of names at all levels, Marvin Minsky, Stephen Hawking. And the point is that if Epstein was able to acquire all these connections and make them into very close personal friends or obligés, or perhaps victims of a blackmail racket, you have to understand how that could happen, given that Epstein was born in very humble circumstances and that he was a college dropout and was basically brought in through a network which seems to have been tied to the late Robert Maxwell, which might explain why Ghislaine Maxwell, Robert's daughter, and Epstein became very close, and probably the connection with Ghislaine Maxwell brought Epstein even further higher in the hierarchy of power because of the connections that she had from her father and from the world that she belonged to. So this leads, of course, to the key issue which has been raised by so many of the researchers, including very noisily Tucker Carlson, but of course Whitney Webb has done a tremendous work on this. One can read her book in 2 volumes, A Country Under Blackmail, in which it has become apparent that the entire system, nominally headed by Epstein, although there were probably even more powerful people behind him who put him up as the facade, this network is tied to one of America's greatest political and diplomatic, how would I call it, an enigma, or you may give it another name, which is the special relationship with Israel. And the fact that very definitely and very openly, Israel has been practicing a number of techniques to keep the US bound to follow its wishes and to implement decisions that Israel wants to be implemented. Now, this is particularly visible with Epstein, who was personally in touch with 4 successive Israeli prime ministers, and whose current prime minister was, of course, also close to him. And that, of course, brings into play the relation between no less than 2 US presidents with Epstein, Bill Clinton, and obviously Donald Trump. And if you hear some of the comments that are made by some of Trump's closest former friends and family members, such as Mary Trump, his niece, or such as his biographer, Michael Wolff, you see that there is something tremendously disturbing about Trump's past, both at the personal level and at the business level, and possibly also at the political level, insofar as he was probably groomed to get into the position that he has by certain interests that wanted him to play the role that he's playing. So that brings us to question very seriously the traditional story of Trump being the outsider who came to destroy the deep state. Now, there may be factions within the deep state, whatever you may want to call the deep state, but clearly, if Trump belongs to doesn't belong to one faction, then he certainly has to belong to another, because the kind of support he got, despite his many failings and his many mistakes, which are clear in terms of his rhetoric, in terms of his actions, you can imagine that he's serving the interest of certain people. And if you go back to the matter of the Epstein files or the Epstein dossier, you see that his attitude changed very abruptly after the last visit that Prime Minister Netanyahu paid to Washington, D.C., where he had this private meeting with both Trump and the Vice President Vance. And it seems that after that conversation, Trump decided that it was all important not to release any more information about Epstein, his connections, and his work. And obviously, once you go into the details of Epstein's operations, then you find some very big name in American finance, in particular Leslie Wexner, Leon Black, the Pritzkers, the Crowns, and I could go on enumerating them. You see, so what you have there is a massive financial power network, which is very clearly tied to a foreign country. And it's not Russia, it's not China. Of course, Russia and China are playing their own games in American politics, as most other great powers try to. But it is particularly the Israeli problem, which has now become very acute, because I think for the first time in modern America, that relationship has come under increasing scrutiny and has aroused increasing controversy and even anger. You can see the way many of the eminent speakers of the MAGA crowd are talking about Israel and about its stranglehold on American politics and on American finance, because clearly Marjorie Taylor Greene has again said that she had been trying to stop more and more literal donations made to Israel, ranging into the billions, at a time when a lot of social programs and other necessary expenditures in the US are being cut. And in fact, we all know that you cannot withdraw even a penny of the money that is allocated for Israel, because that is just beyond any kind of question or discussion or controversy. So for the first time, we see a real split between a large part of the political base, both on the right and on the left, and the bipartisan elite, which has been, including Trump, which has been desperately trying to cover this up and to keep feeding Israel with what Israel wants and supporting Israel's policies in the Gaza Strip, as well as towards Iran, towards Syria, although that's less clear now. But obviously, there was an agreement between Israel and the US that the first priority was to overthrow Assad, and that whoever would come afterwards, in that case, a notorious former terrorist leader, that would be much more acceptable to both Israel and the US. So where does that lead us? It leads us to the fact that America, the United States, now has to look very deep into its political structure and what is been alluded to for a long time as the deep state, what it consists of, what are its goals, and what are also, for those who are more interested in occult matters, what are its philosophical or symbolic underpinnings. There's been a very interesting discussion, I don't know if you have followed it, about Epstein's ideological or even religious associations or affiliations. Because
you're speaking of his transhumanist ideology, or you're speaking of something else?
I am speaking of his transhumanist ideology applying to himself, but that transhumanist ideology had deeper roots, which have been alluded to in various very serious sources, and of which you can find some, I would say, physical trace in the temple that he built on the Little St. James Island. Sure. Which there has been a reference to that by one of his nieces. Now, I have not been able to verify whether she's actually his niece. She goes by the name Anya Wick because of her current husband, but she has been interviewed by people who had apparently done due diligence on her claims. And she says that as a member of the Epstein family, she belongs to a sect which defines itself as worshippers of Belial or Baal. And that involves sexual magic and some practices which also involve underage girls, because of the belief that the worship of Baal involves the acquisition of certain powers through sex with underage girls. Now, You might say that this is all poppycock, but the fact is that if some people believe it, and if they actually practice this in the belief that this is a key to power, and are able to attract a lot of powerful people who believe that they will benefit in some way or another, you can then explain why so many people, including Bill Clinton, went so many times to the island. And after all, let's face it, people who are either royal princes or former presidents or billionaires are not short of places to spend vacations on. It's not as if they don't have.
I think that, a lot of people, they shy away from even thinking about this sort of material because it does sound absurd, but I think I've heard it said many times that it doesn't really matter whether or not we individually believe in these things, and interfacing with mystical powers through all sorts of obscenities and rituals. The fact is that those many influential operators do believe in those things and do act accordingly. So it's worth looking at and keeping that in mind as a factor in things that shape decision makings and policy globally, much of which can lead to potential um, wars of extermination if we're not at least sensitive to that thing. So I appreciate that very much. But maybe in the next minute or so, could you wrap up the core briefing before we go to Caleb and follow up with the dialogue?
Right. So what I would like to say in the end is that we are now in a very critical situation, which might even bring the US down as far as the polity is concerned. It's a very real possibility. Or there might be, again, the goddess of luck that manages to somehow bring the country out of this condition. But it is, given Trump's mental and physical condition, and given the odds he's facing, and given his manifest and growing inability to deal with both the internal and the international situation, one has to, unfortunately, be ready for the worst. In other words, either the US could really break down into a sort of a very nasty civil war, whether it manifests as an armed conflict or as some sort of intractable political fight. And that naturally has an impact on the entire world, because we can see the repercussions of that internal crisis on the stability of the system. And of course, on the positive side, it probably will help bring about the rise of alternative powers, which are represented by the BRICS, by the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and by others. So really the advent of a multipolar world, which may come and on the ruins of the single superpower. So I will leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Colm. Obviously, there's a lot in there, Caleb, and I mean, for myself, there's a lot of different perspectives about what's behind the Epstein affair being developed the way it is. Some people have said that it's a trap to encourage people to run into a dark MAGA controlled opposition that was set up by Elon, or at least who's ever influencing Elon. Others have different views that Trump really does have some ugly skeletons in the closet to hide. There's definitely the threat of social destabilizations as if the economy does fall into a landslide, with that breakdown of social cohesion that happens with economic crises, and especially systemic ones. You could feasibly have more violent conflict, maybe even a civil war, as Colm had mentioned. And then there's the issue of the BRICS and the broader multipolar alliance that doesn't really want chaos on Earth, but is trying to manage something very unmanageable, or at least very, very daunting. So with all of that said, Caleb, I'll just throw it at you. Do you agree with Combs? Do you share his concerns, or do you have a different perspective on some of those matters?
Well, I appreciate Combs' remarks. He gave an important perspective on the conflict taking place behind the scenes. And I think we all have big questions right now. Will we actually see an end to the war in Ukraine? Is it possible that with everything taking place, with the calls against Zelensky, we could actually see peace in Ukraine? Is it possible that we'll see Obama administration officials who cooked up this whole Russiagate thing, and it's now been revealed by Tulsi Gabbard in these documents that the whole thing was completely a hoax, more of a hoax than any of us imagined. I mean, people watching this, we all knew it was fake to begin with, the idea that there was some kind of Russian conspiracy to get Trump into the White House, but it's more of a hoax than we even imagined. And will there actually be imprisonment of Obama officials for this fraud in American politics that cost the taxpayers millions of dollars? Will the Middle East heat up? What will happen next with the Epstein affair? All of these questions are certainly on our minds. And many people are looking at the Trump White House and saying it is very confused. It doesn't quite know what it is doing. The left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. The head doesn't know what the foot is doing. There's a lot of confusion. And I expect that by September, we will see some level of clear trajectory coming out of the White House. But right now, there's a huge amount of confusion. But that said, my strength and my work has generally been looking at the bigger picture. The news cycle is very important, and to understand what is behind these events is certainly very important. But I look at the big picture. The book that I wrote a couple of years ago that has been translated and published in Chinese, that's been widely circulated, is called "Where is America Going? Marxism, MAGA, and the Coming Revolution." And the thesis of this book is that basically the Western economic system, which at this point I think we can describe as imperialism or globalism, is in a long-term crisis due to technological development. Human creativity and brilliance has exceeded the narrow restraints of a system where production is organized to maximize profits for private owners. We human beings, with our creativity and our brilliance, we are breaking unprecedented, barriers. And with artificial intelligence and with technological advancement, I mean, we are doing things that were only imagined in science fiction novels in the past. And that the built-in problem of poverty created by abundance, people being homeless because there are too many houses, people being hungry because there is too much food, poverty amid plenty, glut, value crisis, overproduction. That crisis, that built-in problem of the profit-centered economic system is being seen on a wider scale than ever before. We human beings at this point have the ability to create a world with so much wealth and abundance. I mean, self-driving cars are just a few years away. And yet that threatens to create more poverty than ever before. And that doesn't make any rational sense. And that ultimately what we need is society to rationally organize production so that human creativity can no longer be restrained. So these great technological advancements can lead to creating a prosperous world for all and completely eliminating poverty. And while the Western system is crashing and burning and trying to deal with the confusion rooted in all of this, and the fact that we now have had all these great technological breakthroughs, there's a whole nother section of the world that has come into being as the result of anti-colonial revolutions. China, the Chinese Revolution. You can talk about the Shia axis of resistance in the Middle East. Russia, that certainly suffered horrendously after the fall of the Soviet Union, but restored itself with state control of oil and gas and a government that took control of natural resources and used that revenue to rebuild the economy strategically. The Russian president based his, he wrote an academic thesis about how to restructure Russia's economy around what he called national champions, state-run energy companies that could be used then to kind of centrally plan and build up a private sector and raise Russia up. And he put it into practice, and Russia is quite strong now as a result of these economic policies. You can talk about the Bolivarian countries in Latin America, and now we have the BRICS, and we have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. We have the Eurasian Economic Union. We have a wave of resistance in the Union of Sahel States on the African continent. There's a whole section of the world where the chaos of the market doesn't prevail. And you have states that come out of anti-colonial revolutions that are investing in their people, not in derivative rip-off schemes and not in the profits of finance, but rather in their people and in the building of physical economy. And they are rising as a result of the fact that they're not restrained by the irrationality of the market. And that contradiction between the Western system that is in chaos and free fall due to the built-in problems of production organized for profit and the rising new world of states rooted in anti-colonial revolutions that are investing in their populations and physical economy and pro-growth, that contradiction is hanging over the Western system. And then that has reopened what has long been the big fight in American politics. It's funny, this program, you named it Tragedy and Hope. And that's the name of a book by Carol Quigley, the historian who was a mentor to Bill Clinton, who talked about the Anglo-American establishment and talked about how in American politics, you had the power of the New England old money elite that were tied in with the British Empire, that believed the way to resolve the problems of overproduction and value crisis and poverty amid plenty is with degrowth. they are Malthusians, and that basically they want to drive down the population, reduce consumption, and forcibly stabilize the system so that they can stay at the top. And this goes back to the round table group that was established by the estate of Cecil Rhodes. This goes back to the Rockefeller family that were big promoters of abortion and birth control, not because they believed in women's rights and freedom, but because they believed the poor people were breeding too much, and that was the basis of the problem. And that there has long been an axis in American power, the old money elite, that have sought to stabilize the system with degrowth methods, with Malthusianism. Meanwhile, there is a big layer of the American elite that just want to make money. And following the Second World War, those folks, the lower levels of capital, especially folks associated with California and the Southwest, Texas, Arizona, those forces got tied in with the military. And they were pro-growth, and they were tied in with the military-industrial complex. And you can really interpret post-World War II American politics as a fight between the Eastern establishment and the lower-level capitalists that were tied in with the military-industrial complex. And you can interpret the assassination of John F. Kennedy, the impeachment of Richard Nixon, as kind of a push and pull between the bulk of the American elite that just want to make money and the old money New England liberal establishment that wanted to control them, degrow, depopulate, and stabilize the U.S. economy. And that push and pull has gone on. And there's a lot written about it. There's a very good book called The Yankee and Cowboy War by Carl Oglesby that lays this out. I will give credit to Lyndon LaRouche. He had an understanding of this push and pull in American politics, and began as a Marxist, but saw that leftism and Marxism was starting to serve the degrowth Eastern establishment, and then pivoted to trying to build a pro-growth movement that would align itself perhaps with the military and have the military invest in scientific research and development. And there's many different forces in American politics that have caught on to this. What is interesting about the time that we're living in is that basically you could argue that in our time, the Yankee and Cowboy War has been reversed. It is the lower level capitalists that are saying we want economic growth, and Russia and China and countries around the world breaking out of poverty and building themselves up is the potential to make more profits for us, and we should invest in them. And it is the Eastern establishment that is saying, oh no, in light of the crisis that we are facing, we have to do everything we can to stabilize at home with implementing a police state and authoritarian methods and censorship. And we have to wage all-out war against Russia, China, Iran, Venezuela, the Sahel states in Africa, any place that might not be under our domination. We have to fight desperately to hold on to unipolarity and the rule of the world by Wall Street and London. Whereas there are many lower-level capitalists, military manufacturers, hotel owners, people throughout the wealthy elite in the United States who say, you know what, if Russia and China rise and their people rise up and spend more money, we can make more money as well. And Donald Trump, to some degree or other, at least appealed to lower levels of capital that said, look, we want to have economic growth. We're not on board with these lockdowns. We're not on board with this climate hysteria. We're not on board with all of the efforts of the ultra rich to stabilize and keep the unipolar world by maintaining control and implementing a low-wage police state at home and marching us closer toward the danger of a new world war around the world. And Donald Trump very much appealed to those sentiments. And Elon Musk seems to have also appealed to those sentiments. And Donald Trump at least took power as kind of the leader of a coalition of the lower levels of capital against the Eastern establishment and against their kind of agenda of staying at the top no matter what. Now, Trump has taken office, and he has done largely the opposite of what he said he would do. He said he would end the war in Ukraine within 24 hours, and it's still not over. And we're 6 months into his presidency. In addition to that, Donald Trump said he would not escalate and create new wars, and he bombed Iran and escalated the situation in the Middle East quite dramatically. Donald Trump said he would protect free speech and civil liberties, and he's been deporting people for their opinion about Palestine and for protesting against the policies of Israel. However, at the same time, we realize that part of the reason Donald Trump has been in this position is because he's been accused of being a foreign agent. He was accused of having colluded with Russia. And now Tulsi Gabbard, the former member of Congress and active duty U.S. military individual who Donald Trump appointed to be his director of national intelligence, she is revealing what a hoax and what efforts were made to control Donald Trump and keep him from perhaps carrying out his agenda. And that Tulsi Gabbard herself represents a faction that I almost want to just call the Pentagon realists, right? Who are looking at this, and they're looking at the war game scenarios that get played out and the computer simulations. And they're saying, look, all out war with Russia and China, it's not going to end well for the United States. It's certainly not going to end well for humanity. We need to just figure out how we can transition to a multipolar world. And below all of this is an ideological issue, right? In Russia, there's a lot of talk about the fourth political theory. Alexander Dugin talks about liberalism and the Western ideology that views individualism above all else, and that human beings, when it gets down to it, we're collective creatures, and that we do relate to other people. That's how we view ourselves. Everything human beings do is collective. And that the Western system that wants to break down any notion of group identity is coming apart, whereas around the world there is a collective identity. You can talk about civilizations of the East and empires of the sea, thalassocracy and telerocracy. But you can also look at the fact that, Tulsi Gabbard comes out of the military, her religious background. She is from a Hindu sect that is rather illiberal in their views, and that the Western liberal perspective is breaking down, and illiberalism, which is just kind of the natural way human beings are. Human beings are collective and do identify themselves with groups. That is rising. And so this is the crisis that we're in. I think the Trump administration will start to pivot clearly in one direction in September. I don't know what that direction will be. I've been very disappointed by the Trump administration and how they've acted so far, but I know they're being pulled in many different directions and that they will respond to the different forces that push on them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems to me right now that there are different ideas of what the post-globalization system is going to be. There does seem to be a general consensus that the system that was unleashed in large measure from 1971 with the floating of the US dollar, from the gold reserve system, and the embrace of this consumer society speculative system of deregulation, that system has come to an end. And it's a fight over what the terms of and the new system will look like. What will it be based upon? Who will it benefit? And I hear multipolarity misused by various forces. I mean, I think that not everybody who uses the terminology agrees that it means the same thing. So when I hear like a Marco Rubio using it, on the one hand, I'm happy to hear that there's not an attempt to romanticize unipolarity, but at the same time, I don't think it means the same thing as it does when a Xi Jinping or Putin says the words. Some seem to believe that it means simply dividing the world into empires in a Hobbesian sort of clash as we wait to have the eventual fight for unipolarity down the line, or like some weird Orwellian system. Others actually do have this view that, like you were alluding to, Caleb, that it's better to have a respect for other cultures, other power blocks, while at the same time cooperating on win-win mutual, universal needs. So I'm looking right now at the military buildup. There's like 5 simultaneous military games happening, exercises, 2 of which are world historic. One involves Space Force in China's backyard. There's disruptions on the soft underbelly of Eurasia. Azerbaijan, Armenia, are seeing some major flanking maneuvers where they're being pulled, it seems, into a Western orbit that could feasibly threaten the greater Eurasian partnership. So what do you, I'll throw this at you, Com, and then I'd like to get Caleb's thoughts on this as well. Do you see the faction that wants cooperation in the West coming out? Like, do you see that as a viable thing right now? I mean, a lot of people are talking about a potential Trump appearance in China in September with Putin and Xi Jinping. It's being floated, not really confirmed. But do you see that there is hope for the U.S. waking up and taking part in a positive idea of multipolarity, or do you see that as a bit of a pipe dream right now?
I think that there is an innate contradiction in Trump's apparent espousal of some kind of multipolarity, in the sense that he claimed he was not in favor of intervening in other countries and staging, coups and color revolutions. But on the other hand, he is trying to find another way to maintain and even expand American hegemony. It was very clear when he went to the Gulf states and when he basically said, I love you people, I love Arabs, the usual Trump, euphoria, but you have to bring billions and trillions into the US. You can't invest anywhere else. You have to invest with us. So in other words, what he's trying to do is reduce the US expenditure. Remember, he's a businessman and he has been through 5 or 6 bankruptcies. So he's trying to make more money and spend less money. Of course, he can't be logical with himself even then, because his budget is going to seemingly add another 3 trillion in deficit over the next 10 years, the big, beautiful bill. But still, he feels that he can make up for that with tariffs, which seems to be a very cockeyed idea. Not many of the, I would say, seasoned economists agree with him. So, even in, let's face it, somebody like Rubio is a very junior character. And I don't think he really has an experience or understanding the way the world works. So trying to be reassuring with other countries and saying, we are not the same. It reminds me of George Bush Jr. or even George Bush Sr. Saying that, a kinder, gentler America and 1,000 points of light, new world order, which meant what people wanted to see in it. So I don't really hope at all under the Trump leadership that something consistent, coherent, and truly beneficial to other countries would surface. Because clearly Trump wants to, let's face it, exploit other countries to make America rich. That's his leitmotiv. We'll be so rich, I am very rich, everybody will be rich in America, and basically you people outside will pay for it. So for him to change that tune doesn't seem likely to happen. Now, whether Vance inherits the mantle sooner than we think is another possibility. And, there are health reasons and others. In that case, of course, the jury is out as to what Vance seems to have some pretty good ideas in some way. His speech in Munich was quite remarkable in many ways. He told the Europeans what they needed to hear. But then again, there are some disturbing associations. If you look at the background of Vance, he's very close to Peter Thiel, who is supposed to have sponsored him in politics. And Peter Thiel is another, I would say, transhumanist Superman candidate. He's basically a CIA front. Most of his money came from CIA contracts. And we are now in a situation where, let's face it, a lot of the richest people in the world are essentially contractors for the intelligence agencies. And what they do is provide surveillance, control, and espionage. And they get paid very lavishly for it because they do things that the government doesn't want to be doing formally, because it would create all sorts of problems in terms of accountability and in terms of laws and regulations. So they entrust those huge projects to entrepreneurs. And Trump is definitely also a product of that system. We have seen what he wanted to do with the data centers and artificial intelligence and quantum computing. So, as I said, right now I think the horizon is bleak in America, because the whole panic of the ruling class, wherever it is, the entire American ruling class, by and large, is very worried that they lose primacy, and they are already losing primacy, to China and other countries that are rising behind China.
In Trump's first term, Caleb, there was a lot of points of optimism. Following, Trump at various moments appeared in Beijing, had organized a U.S.-China special relationship or a trade deal that would involve China helping to stimulate the rebuilding of the U.S. manufacturing sector that's been destroyed systematically. I think $300 billion was the plan for the first tranche. Of course, a lot of that was sabotaged with COVID and everything that came with that. You see right now Obviously, you're taking you have a much more optimistic perspective than what we're hearing from Combe. But do you see right now a potential for a revival of that spirit? I mean, I know that, like I mentioned, that there is discussion that the Russian side have said that they're open. They would be very happy if Trump were to appear in Beijing to celebrate the end of World War II in September. Um, we know that there is, a potential for cooperation with China on a variety of things. China still, has major control of global rare earths. The idea of having an AI driven revolution in the United States with a technological and machine tool rebuilding is a great idea, but you can't do any of that without utilizing a lot of rare earths, a lot of the minerals strategically that are under the influence of China. So it does seem like they can't get away from that fact, and they would be best to work with China. What are your thoughts on those specific angles?
Well, regarding Trump, his first term, what's clear is that MAGA is much bigger than Trump, and that MAGA kind of represents the sleeping giant of the American people who are tired of their wages going down, tired of these wars being waged all overseas for the profits of billionaires, and that MAGA is going to take on a life of its own, whether with a new name or not. And that is the beginning of what is ultimately needed in America, which is an anti-monopoly coalition, right? We need the lower levels of capital, the small business owners, and the working class of the heartland to come together and demand a government of action that fights for working families, a pro-growth government. That is what is ultimately needed. As far as Trump going to Beijing, I would like that. That would be great. And that Tulsi Gabbard and her revelations, we have an article on our website at the Center for Political Innovation. One of our members said, Tulsi Gabbard broke Trump out of jail. Now it's time to rebuild the World Anti-Fascist Alliance. The reason Trump couldn't go and celebrate Victory Day in Moscow with so many world leaders was because he was accused of being an agent of Putin. And now that those allegations have been debunked, that creates an opening for Donald Trump to head to Beijing and be part of the celebrations of victory in Asia alongside the Chinese head of state. And that would be a great thing. Unfortunately, there is a big effort within the MAGA camp to equate the Democratic Party with China and to equate woke insanity with China. And part of that is that a counter gang, a woke liberal activist group called the Party for Socialism and Liberation, that plays a very negative role in trying to keep anti-imperialist sentiments attached to the kind of liberal Russiagate, Trump derangement syndrome politics. They have been subpoenaed by the U.S. Congress. Now, I don't agree with PSL, and I think the way they've run the Palestine demonstrations has been very unproductive. They've basically been doing everything they could to make the protests hostile and unfriendly to average Americans and et cetera. But at the same time, the U.S. Congress and congressional committees playing up the idea that PSL are somehow agents of China. And that woke politics and China are, in cahoots with each other. I mean, the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party and the way that they rule China and invest in their people and promote love of country and family and patriotism and woke liberal politics that is shrill and destructive, they have absolutely nothing in common with each other. And the typical MAGA narrative that, that wokeism is communism and it's all a conspiracy from China. Joe Biden worked for China. It's all a big Chinese plot. That narrative is so stupid and so out of touch with reality. But I see a lot of people in the MAGA camp promoting this. It's pretty typical. Your typical conservative podcast begins with talking about, woke people. Aren't they really, really annoying? And then starts repeating Cold War anti-communism. Communism killed a bajillion people and China big, bad, and scary. And that's your typical MAGA narrative. And it's destructive because MAGA, in its essence, MAGA folks want economic growth in America, not wars around the world. But that kind of stupid Cold War anti-communism, et cetera, is the kind of thing that gets us into wars and gets us into conflicts around the world. One of my biggest concerns right now is the danger of a kind of years of lead in America. Because in Italy, when Italy was set to leave NATO, the CIA engaged in Operation Gladio with the funding of far-right groups and far-left groups like the Red Brigades, assassinations, bombings, killings. They created a body count. They created a lot of political confusion where people didn't know what side people were on, and people were afraid to get politically active because they might get shot. And that's why Italy is still in NATO, even though coming out of World War II in the 50s and 60s, they didn't want to be part of NATO. The Italian public wanted Italy to be more independent, perhaps friendlier to Russia, etc. And it was through the covert manipulation of politics and the promotion of violence, bloodthirsty political violence, assassinations, shooting people in their legs and crippling them for life, kidnappings, the Aldo Moro, the former prime minister, being kidnapped when it became clear he wanted to form a coalition government with the Communist Party. And all of that led to a situation where, against the Italian public's will, they stayed as part of the Atlanticist bloc against the Soviet Union. That's what I believe the intelligence apparatus and the Eastern establishment is trying to do in America. They want to create a body count between NATO and between the MAGA crowd and the woke crowd. They want to make American politics so confusing, no one knows who's on what side. They want people to be afraid to get politically active because they might get shot or assassinated or kidnapped or something like that. And we need to oppose political violence, right? It is one thing to argue that people that are under attack have the right to defend themselves, but assassinations, bombings, political murder, which is becoming almost routine in America, there's a lot more political violence that needs to be very loudly opposed. That is the one thing that will prevent the overwhelming majority of the American people from getting what they want. No matter where you go in America, red state, blue state, north, south, religious, conservative, rural, urban, people know, number one, that this country is ruled by a group of billionaires and bankers who don't care about them. Two, they know that those billionaires and bankers are getting us into wars that do not benefit average Americans. And three, they know that our freedoms are being taken away. The freedoms that we're told make America great, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, the right to privacy, all of that is being stripped away. We need a real polarization around the understanding that we don't want World War III, we don't want a low-wage police state, and we want our living standards to rise. That is the real polarization we need, and we need to reject the false polarization that is being fomented to try and control us.
Well said, Caleb. Colm, I think a lot of people have noted as well in recent years that there has been a romantic revisionism of the events of World War II, and not only did we get a glimpse of that first, or an oddity with Nazi symbolism and heroes of the Nazi regime in Ukraine being brought into becoming official national heroes, with schools and buildings and roads named after Bandera and Mikola Lebed and company. But then we also began seeing second, third generation technocrats with major influence. Chrystia Freeland in Canada, with a grandfather who ran the major press agency for the Nazis in Ukraine during World War II. We've got Ursula von der Leyen with some weird family connections too through her father that interface with Operation Gladio. Now the new MI6 director also has a grandfather who is known as the Butcher, as a Russian defector who joined the Nazis in Ukraine and developed a really wicked reputation. So it seems like these things which were never resolved, there's something unresolved after World War II, which was tied into the creation of NATO, which, it's a funny irony, right? That people are freaked out. They're being trained to emotionally melt down at the word of China as America's natural enemy. But yet the actual Nazis that worked with the Japanese fascists, funded by Wall Street and London bankers, to bring about a new world order back 80 years ago that killed millions of Chinese and 25 million Russians and many grandparents of today's generation in the West. They were given new jobs to run NATO's secret armies, to run Operation Gladio, the Days of Lead, as you pointed out, Caleb. I mean, these are to run NATO. 8 consecutive Eastern European heads of NATO's Eastern European Command were all unreconstructed Nazis. So it's there's something definitely unresolved, and I'm curious to get your thoughts. What do you say when you encounter people who flip out who consume way too much anti-China propaganda, and yet there's this reality slapping them in the face that they should be looking at? I know you've pointed out the danger of civil war is another thing that you're concerned about. What do you tell them? How do you address this?
It's not only against China. In Europe, it's even more against Russia, because, again, Putin has been made into the new Hitler, and Russia is seen as the definitive villain and the greatest threat for the survival of Europe. There is always that. I mean, I've had very serious people in Sweden and other countries tell me, the moment Ukraine is defeated, Russia will invade all of Europe. So, of course, not only will they restore the Warsaw Pact and the other Comecon, but they will take over even Western Europe. So that's a very common story which has been propagated by the likes of Rutte, who is now the head of NATO, because it's a convenient story, and it also, in a way, gives an excuse to the Nazis of saying, after all, what they had said, that they were fighting for Western civilization, which is now what the Ukrainian leadership is saying, it has some, some ground in truth, that basically they are fighting whatever you call it, Asian barbarity, Russian, brutality. But let's face it, the Americans played that game very early on, because right after World War II, they collected all the Nazi scientists and high-level technocrats they could find. And some of them were left in Europe, but they became founding fathers of the European Union, such as Stein. There were others who practically started the European community, and they came straight from the Nazi system. Now, the Russians also collected a lot of Nazis to make them work in their scientific facilities, but the Americans with Operation Paperclip and others were definitely the champions, and they never tried to change their mindsets. Denazification was not in question as long as they were useful. And then, as you said, there is Operation Gladio, which was kept as Operation Staying Behind, which was a way to prevent a communist takeover and to make sure that, if need be, the old Nazis would be brought back to help. And that's how, Gehlen, who headed the German secret police, was a former unredeemed Nazi, because they were seen as clever people. They knew the communists, they knew the enemy, and they were actually not so far away ideologically from some of the leading European states. And that's why you could see that Hitler and some of his lieutenants had been trying for years to convince the British that there was no antagonism between Britain and Germany, and that the British Empire could thrive while Germany built continental Europe. And as you know, there were many takers for that, including the Clive Set and some others. So naturally, this sense that there could be an all-European alliance to protect Europe from invasions, especially the Russian invasion, is something that could easily be revived when convenient. And now that there is no more a bipolar world in the old sense, then you are able to talk openly about we can all absorb some of the positive features of the Third Reich in terms of economic and industrial buildup and military buildup, which is exactly what Europe is talking about right now. Let's make it let's become a military superpower.
Right. Yeah, that is a disturbing quality, or it's almost like a strange contradiction that the technocrats in Europe are trying to force in an unnatural resolution, which was this obsession with defeating Russia by having this like military investment bank outside of the national budgets that's supposedly going to stimulate the growth of a new military industrial powerhouse, while at the same time holding on to this zero growth logic of green economics that will reduce the ability of the society to exist with these low quality energy sources on the one hand. So they're trying to contract the population and keep control of a degrowth system on the one hand, while at the same time needing to grow a certain type of industrial economy to fight and destroy their perceived enemy, Russia, and maybe China. Caleb, what do you think of this contradiction? I see this in Canada too, frankly. Under the current regime in Canada, there's this obsession with trying to support rearm Europe and balance these two seemingly, because we've spent 50 years deindustrializing and making our society more intellectually mediocre, less economically independent than we were 50, 60 years ago when we still had industries and more economic sovereignty. And now all of a sudden they want to try to magically bring it back, which is something that we saw in a similar way with Germany leading up to World War II. But different in the sense that Germany didn't self-mutilate over several generations their culture, their society, even though they still had some serious, dangerous problems. It seems like we've got similarities, but differences too. What can you speak to that?
Well, it's interesting because the underlying issue behind both World War I and World War II was the tension between the sea-based powers of the United States and Britain and the land-based countries on the European mainland, right? And that both of them were Western countries, both of them were colonizers, but the European mainland and the British Empire and the American forces, the American Empire, I guess you can call it. They have had contradictory interests, and the greatest fear of the British Empire has always been a Russia-German alliance. If there was a Russia-German alliance, then they would lose control of the European mainland. One aspect of the tension between them has been the issue of energy. Right? The British and the Americans control the oil markets. And that's why the French government has been one of the biggest supporters of nuclear energy, nuclear power. And the French government has invested in it heavily. And you'll recall that in the 1980s, at one point, the French government was working with the government of Iraq to develop peaceful nuclear energy. And Israel, in coordination with the United States, destroyed the Iraqi peaceful nuclear energy facilities and killed not only Iraqi scientists, but a French citizen who was working in the facility. And that Greenpeace, the environmental group that is very anti-nuclear energy, has clashed with the French government, and French intelligence has carried out operations against Greenpeace because Greenpeace is pro-big oil and anti-nuclear energy, and that the European mainland would like to assert its energy independence with peaceful nuclear energy and with not being reliant on the dominant oil banking forces of Britain and the United States. Now, what's interesting is that in light of this whole thing with Russia, right, we're seeing the rise in Germany of the Alternative for Germany party. We're seeing the rise of Marine Le Pen, and that the new right of Europe is largely forces on the European mainland that are saying, look, we're getting screwed here. It is not in our economic interest to have the Nord Stream pipeline blown up. It is not in our economic interest to get rid of all of our nuclear power plants and rely on oil and gas from America. And that fighting with Russia, put the issues of Ukraine aside, put all that aside, it just isn't in our economic interest. Whereas the political systems of France and Germany and Austria and so many countries are just under the dominance of British puppets that are just not going to allow these countries to follow their own economic interest and are presiding over what you described. I mean, these degrowth policies, basically economically demolishing their country, getting rid of their energy, getting rid of everything, and then just emphasizing that they need to get all in this effort against Russia, and that the underlying feeling across the heartland of Europe is that this is not in Europe's economic interest, and Europeans know this in their bones. But the political system is very much rigged in favor of British and American puppets. And, you have recent elections that we've seen in EU countries where candidates are just not allowed to participate because they might want a better relationship with Russia. And that we're seeing kind of the establishment in these countries that was propped up by the United States, going back to Operation Gladio, going back to the Cold War and the Galen Organization. We're seeing that establishment losing its credibility with the public and becoming more and more desperate as it holds on to power, because what they're presiding over is just not in the economic interest of the countries on the European mainland. And that same tension that gave birth to World War I and World War II, there would never have been a Hitler without Hjalmar Schacht, the German economist. And Hjalmar Schacht, basically, he felt that the future of Germany was not in alliance with Britain and with America, that Germany had its own independent economic interest. And he brought Hitler to power on that basis. And we saw the horrendous events that resulted from that. The British gave Hitler support at the beginning because they saw him as a barrier against communism. But then when Hitler aligned himself with Hjalmar Schacht and Germany tried to reestablish itself as a colonial power in World War II, we saw the horrendous things that went on. And that led to World War II. But ultimately, that tension, the tension between the European mainland and the Atlanticist powers, that tension remains. And the European mainland is just getting, the shit kicked out of it. I mean, the fact that the Nord Stream pipeline was blown up and they can't even acknowledge that America did it. And they can't even, they don't even have the ability to say, that's wrong. And they're just, having their economies demolished and their population is voting for these alternative parties that want to do something about it. This is a sleeping giant. It's only a matter of time before Europe's real economic interest, which is not fighting with Russia, asserts itself. And that's what they're really afraid of here.
Right. That's a good point. That's a good point, and I think it's a good thing that you're reminding us that the overarching the masses, the people as a whole, are not having their voices represented by those few crusader technocrat types who seem to be belligerently obsessed with geopolitical control. They do want peace, they want prosperity. The business interests are not being represented by and large either. They're being told to basically go for harikiri or harikari in the context of some sort of a weird self-sacrifice for the greater good. So yeah, that's an important idea that you're raising. We're going to shift to some questions from the audience who are watching live right now. There's one question that just came in that I think it's a simple question, but I'd like to get both of your thoughts on how you address this. They ask, is the conflict in the Middle East really a battle of the Abrahamic religions, or is there something else going on that's not simply, because that's how it's often framed, right? It's just that religions, if you let them just be religions, they'll just clash with each other forever, and it's just because of religions being different, and that's what they do. And often there's certain things left out of that discourse. So I'll throw it to you, Combe. How would you respond to that?
Very clearly, the Zionist project was a European project originally. And then, of course, it was heavily supported by the United States later on. And it was also, let's remember it, a socialist project. So it had little to do with religion. Herzl himself was not religious. And many of the founding Zionists were secularists or socialists. Some of them were agnostic, and they felt that it was all a matter of national identity, because they felt every people should have a land, and therefore they needed a land to be contrary to the Orthodox traditional Jewish view that Israel is wherever Jews are, and until the Messiah comes, there will be no new Israel. Herzl and the other Zionists broke that tradition and tried to make Israel into a modern, originally socialist state, which has now become anything but socialist. But as a result, I do not think that you can call this a clash of religions. You can call it a clash of civilizations, because on the one hand, you have the European, American, imperialist and capitalist tradition, which Israel represents in the Middle East. Let's face it, Israel is often proud to be called an unsinkable American aircraft carrier in the region. And on the other hand, you have, of course, Arab nationalism, which involves both Muslims and Christians. And before that, by and large, a coexistence between the three Abrahamic religions was rather peaceful, although there were problems because of the presence of the Ottoman Empire. But all in all, it is the relative harmony or synergy, or at least symbiosis, between Arab Jews and Arab Muslims was quite viable, and it endured for centuries and centuries. And it's only, I would say, the arrival of the European and then later the American Jews that this balance was broken, because these people were clearly completely alien to the local culture. They brought a different language, a different understanding of both politics and society. And this has been Israel's problem. No matter how we want to look at it, it is a bit like what South Africa was until the end of apartheid. And these situations are very hard to change, because a dominant minority or majority in the case of Israel, although the majority is now almost no longer a majority, it never wants to leave its privileges, and therefore it keeps using every possible means to preserve its power. So, and of course, it is protected by the American belief that Israel is vital to its own interest, or simply by the fact that the Jewish American community is far too powerful and they impose a Zionist agenda on the United States. But I certainly do not think this is at the root a conflict between religions.
Caleb, can I get your thoughts on that too?
Yeah, I mean, I'll answer that by talking about how, especially since the end of the Cold War, we've seen a rise of Islam in the Middle East. Arab nationalism, which was secular, has kind of been, fading. And that Islam, the world Islamic movement at this point divides into three categories. You have the westernized Muslims that come out of the Muslim Brotherhood. This is a current that started in Egypt and was kind of in awe of the West, argued that the West was more Islamic, etc., and that the USA began funding that movement against Abdel Nasser in the 1950s. And Turkey and Qatar are the main supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood and Westernized Islam. You also have Wahhabism, which is the ideology that justifies the, authoritarian government of Saudi Arabia, the kind of absolute monarchy that, this is Salafism. These are people that want to kind of restore the time of the Prophet Muhammad, that, that they eat with three fingers because the Prophet Muhammad supposedly ate with three fingers, and that they want to almost restore an economic and political system that mimics feudalism, but they make very effective foot soldiers in Syria and elsewhere. But then you have the third current, which is the Shia current, and Shia Islam has been around for over 1,000 years. However, in the 1979 revolution, Shia Islam became an expression of anti-colonialism and national liberation movements, because Shia Islam has a tradition of standing with the oppressed, because the 12 imams, most of them were martyred in fights, fighting for the oppressed against the rich. Shia Islam kind of became a Middle Eastern expression of anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, and anti-capitalism in a lot of cases. And now the Shia axis of resistance in Yemen with the Houthis, in Bahrain, where you have the movement against the U.S.-backed monarchy, in Syria, they were the biggest fighters in support of the Syrian government, etc. Centered around the Islamic Republic of Iran. They kind of represent the main force of resistance to Israel in the region. And Israel is a Western colonial project. So yeah, I don't view it as a fight of Abrahamic religions. However, Islam has divided into three, and especially since the conflict in Gaza has escalated, the Shia axis of resistance is winning more and more popularity, and it's just winning the hearts and minds of the entire Muslim world. I mean, the Houthis stood up for the Palestinians in a way that no one else did, but their naval blockade, their picket line in the Red Sea, you will not cross as long as Gaza continues to face this bombing. And the Houthi movement in Yemen, and the kind of the anti-imperialist forces that are modeled on the Islamic Revolutionary Guards of Iran, they are at this point who those who oppose Israel are cheering for around the world. And as much as Donald Trump has attacked Iran and attacked their nuclear facilities, I believe the Shia axis of resistance, at least in terms of public opinion, is very much the winner at this point. Around the world, people are supporting them and cheering for them.
There's a question here from Red Axis called Caleb, saying, Caleb, I saw reports that child malnutrition levels in Yemen are astronomical. How could they solve this? Should they stop sacrificing on behalf of others and instead just focus on themselves? I mean, certainly Yemen has carried out have sacrificed immensely over the last, really, since 2014 and the civil war, or the war with Saudi Arabia being launched. It's been quite astounding to see the resilience, but at the same time, the suffering is immense. What would you say to that?
Well, I mean, Saudi Arabia blockaded Yemen and bombed them, since 2015. At this point, there's a bit of a freeze in the fighting, because it's just not good PR for Saudi Arabia to be attacking Yemen at a time that Yemen is standing with the Palestinians as they are. But one of the main principles of the Houthi movement is they're fighting for economic development. They want public control of their natural resources. They want to use Yemen's oil wealth to build the country up. And the founder of the Houthi movement, Hussein al-Houthi, the founder of Ansar Allah, he built, healthcare clinics all across the mountainous regions of Yemen that provided healthcare for people. He set up the Young Believers, which was like a summer camp program, a religious youth program that provided literacy to some of the poorest people in the world. And the Houthi movement is about economic development. Right now, they're in war conditions. They've been in war conditions since 2015, but through their solidarity with the Palestinians, they've gotten a freeze, at least, on the Saudi bombardment of them. And hopefully this leads to a situation where they can begin economically developing, which is the basis of their program to begin with. If you look at the movement, the sermons of Hussein al-Houthi talking about how Yemen was a rock on which nothing could be planted, calling for them to develop their own agriculture, etc. That is the thrust of the Ansar Allah movement, is a drive for economic development. So right now they're in war conditions, but hopefully those war conditions ease and they're given some peace so they can actually carry their program out.
Thank you. Gerald Petchnuk asks, can Colm and Caleb comment on the idea of the four powers? And I think Gerald is referring to the potential alliance of Russia, China, India, and the United States feasibly working together to impose a new economic architecture onto the world. I would just add a little bit of coloring to that. India also seems to be playing a bit of a dangerous game, in my view. And Com has a lot of familiarity with the Indian situation, so I'd be especially curious on Com's view on this particular point here, which is that there is the floating of the idea of the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor as an alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative, which it seems like, at least from the narratives that I'm getting here in my western part of the world, it seems like that's something which certain officials are moving forward on, and many people in India high up seem to be in favor of, which involves having a corridor through Saudi Arabia, basically striking through Turkey into Europe with mostly pipelines, some roads and rail. Do you see India as being, first of all, playing a dangerous game and maybe becoming lost or lost to the multipolar alliance orientation? And number two, do you guys together see a viability of the US, Russia, India, China or civilizations collaborating and working together? And I'll throw it at home first.
About the four powers, I frankly don't see any realism to it in the foreseeable future, simply because the US would have to change so drastically its foreign policy, and certainly Trump, in my view, will not do it. So there would have to be a different power with, a sort of a renewal with the JFK tradition, if you know what I mean, in the US. Otherwise, there is a very discreet but real revival now of the three-power RIC, Russia, India, China, for the simple reason that they realize they need each other. Of course, we all know how close Russia and China are at present. India has, of course, had for many years a big problem with China. It's not only about the border, it's also about the preponderance of Chinese trade and finance, which has been in some ways very detrimental to Indian industry because of massive cheap imports, which India has not been able to balance out with any kind of exports since the Chinese market is fairly closed. So there is now a discussion on trying to adjust this and create a better balance. And India has made it clear, one, that it would welcome Chinese investments in the Indian economy in the sense of setting up plants, manufacturing facilities, so that goods are not simply exported to India, but rather are made in India. And two, if that happens, India would then be able to consider the Chinese proposal of joining the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Now, with regard to the IMEC corridor, that's a bit of a pipe dream, which was launched by the US and Israel because they had to find some relevance in view of the growth of the Silk Route, the new Silk Route, the BRIC, the BRI, and also the North-South corridor, which has been discussed very actively between Iran, Russia, India, and some Central Asian countries. Now,
just so people could see it, that's the North-South transportation corridor. For those who don't know, that goes from the north of Russia all the way down to India through Iran and Azerbaijan, and at the right is the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor graph. Again, to showcase, I don't have a picture of the Belt and Road, but I think everyone watching it knows what the Belt and Road Initiative generally looks like. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, so India has definitely not seen IMEC as an alternative. It has seen IMEC as a possible supplementary or complementary road. After all, India is open to all initiatives that can lead to business and prosperity. And therefore, it has taken a rather positive view of the proposal, except that it has very quickly become obvious that nothing could move forward until there is a settlement and stability in the region. Because as long as you have the situation that prevails now between Israel, the Houthis, and Iran, not to mention the Hezbollah in Lebanon and Syria, clearly you cannot have any kind of corridor which would involve considerable investments, because you have to build an entire railway line across Saudi Arabia, and the logistics are also very unfavorable, because first you have to ship goods from India to, let's say, the Arab Emirates, the United Arab Emirates, and from them you have to put them on a train. And if you have a single freighter, you probably have to have a train that has something like 300 bogies that has to go into Jordan and then into Israel, and then unload in Haifa, and from there go by sea to either Athens or one Italian port or wherever, Marseille. So it doesn't look very clear at all, especially when you have the Suez Canal, which will hopefully start working again if the clash between the Houthis and Israel ends. And that does not in any way prevent the North-South corridor from proceeding. What has prevented the North-South corridor is that until recently, of course, Iran had so many sanctions against it that it was very difficult for India to move in a big way, apart from the fact that India never moves very fast, and administratively speaking. And then Russia was not that interested. Now Russia has become more interested because of the change in the logistical supply lines and the fact that Russia has turned away from Europe now and is focusing entirely on Asia and Africa, and of course South America as well. So as a result, I think both projects could technically take shape, but I would expect the North-South corridor to take place first, to be established first. The only problem is that India on the west is an island, because Pakistan has always opposed any kind of cooperative venture involving India. So from India, you have to go by sea, whether you go to Iran or whether you go to the United Arab Emirates. And from there, then you can start by rail or by road. But that still creates a logistical, bottleneck. So that's where we are. Beyond that, generally speaking, I think India has always had a policy that they do not want to belong to a bloc. They have said that since 1947. And therefore, any idea that they have to join a bloc is very repugnant to them. They feel like they should be able to work with everybody. On the other hand, the American erratic policies, and especially under Trump, the growing threat of major sanctions against India. There is active talk in America of putting 100% additional tariffs on India as long as it buys Russian oil, which is a lifeline for India. Naturally, India feels that it has to become more actively involved in the BRICS. And as you saw in the last summit in Rio de Janeiro, even though Putin and Xi could not attend, India signed on the entire declaration, which was very long, but which was also quite militant and quite, I would say, assertive against the US policies. And India even signed on the condemnation of the Israeli policy in Gaza and Israeli aggression on Iran and US bombing of Iran. This was not expected because India had always abstained in earlier forums. But at that time, they felt they could not stay out of what is seen as the global south, and they had to join their voices. So when push comes to shove, I think India has to see that its interest lies with its regional neighbors.
Caleb, did you want to chime in on that, or?
I'll just say that the only future of the world economy at this point is with the Eurasian world island. So anything that would bring the United States closer to that, I'm in favor of, whether it's building a bridge or a tunnel over the Bering Sea or lifting sanctions. I mean, we need to just get real and understand that Eurasia is rising right now, and we can either rise with them or we can go down with the colonialists and imperialists and trying to destroy them, which is just not going to be to our benefit.
Yeah, I agree. I guess the last question here I'll just throw out with there's been a lot of discussion. Obviously, de-dollarization is happening. The U.S. dollar has been the sort of the center of U.S. hegemony for many, many decades. However, the system is sitting on a giant speculative bubble, ready to blow, or is blowing as we speak. And we're seeing now the BRICS having come to grow from 4 to 5 to now, I think, 10 members, and a much larger association of BRICS cooperative partners. Thailand, Indonesia being on board, many African countries waiting in line. And their economy currently represents globally something like 40 or 44%, 42% of world GDP. And the growth function in terms of real growth, not just like monetary growth, but real real wealth creation is qualitatively superior than anything we're seeing in the transatlantic basket case West. However, the financial instruments that have been brought online, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, the BRICS Investment Bank, or the New Development Bank, they haven't really been used as real global drivers of investment into large scale infrastructure the way they could be, and maybe the way that the IMF or the World Bank originally were designed to be, but were never permitted to act accordingly when they were brought online after World War II. Do you guys see right now a acceleration in a new BRICS economic architecture, or a new type of architecture that will liberate humanity from the shackles of the City of London, Wall Street, sort of debt-based speculative monstrosity? Or do you see that still moving at too slow of a pace in the process?
Well, I'll say that, it's funny, when Donald Trump was first running for president, he was interviewed by Bill O'Reilly. And one of the things he said in his interview was, he said, "You can't push Russia and China together. And President Obama has done that." And he was saying that he was going to not have Russia and China get closer together. But in Trump's first 4 years, Russia and China got even closer. And then after Trump's presidency, his first term, they got even closer. And that it wasn't about Barack Obama making bad decisions. It was that both of these countries are rising and building up their economies independent of Wall Street and London. And the U.S. and its allies are doing more to attack those countries. And so they're cooperating more and more. And that the Cold War alliance between Russia and China that broke apart in 1961 was about ideology. They were both communist countries. Now Russia and China are aligned economically. Russia, it has oil and gas, and it needs to sell that oil and gas. And China has a huge industrial apparatus that needs lots of oil and gas to run it. And the more the USA and its allies attack both countries, the closer they get to each other economically. And that there are bigger forces at play here than just individual will. It's that Russia and China are competitors. Russia is a competitor on the oil and gas and on the energy markets. China is a competitor on the industrial front. The Huawei phones are better than Apple phones by far. They make the best phones in the world. They make half the steel in the world. And that as the Western, monopolies see Russia and China as competitors, they attack them both and try to limit their ability to export products with sanctions and stuff. And so they get closer to each other. And that's just how this is happening. And Russia and China economically are going to keep rising. And countries are going to see that there's a lot of wealth creation going there, a lot of poverty alleviation, and they're going to want to get in on the action. And, Trump's attitude toward the BRICS countries, at least what he's saying is he's going to put sanctions on them and all of that. But I have heard that there is quite the opposite sentiment inside the Trump administration. And there are some forces within the Trump camp that would really like to get the United States into the BRICS somehow, or create some mechanism through which some of the BRICS wealth creation could trickle into the U.S. economy. We're going to have to see how this develops, but it's not going to go away. And again, the multipolar world in the sense of a multipolar economy with development taking place and countries rising up and multiple centers of economic power beyond Wall Street and London, that is an inevitability. So we need to just accept that and find a way to fit the future and the prosperity and the rebuilding of America into a multipolar world.
Well said. Yep. I'm going to throw it at you for the last 2 cents. What do you think about the growth of an alternative economic architecture right now?
I think it's taking shape as we speak. And I was quite encouraged by some of the recent meetings between the BRICS countries, because there has been greater and greater definition of the system that could be brought to replace the US dollar hegemony. Although all the BRICS countries have dutifully repeated they do not want to abolish the dollar, but they have to find alternatives if the dollar keeps being used as a weapon against them, which is a very real fact. So, for example, recently Panama has joined the BRICS Bank, and so has Cuba. And this shows that there will be more and more interest in developing the BRICS Bank, as well as the bank that was set up by China for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, as alternatives to the World Bank and IMF, insofar as World Bank and IMF are controlled by the West and do not generally take into account the priorities of developing countries. So, of course, there was that somewhat unrealistic proposal that was made by Brazil, and which Russia actually shot down very quickly, saying we're not ready to set up an alternative BRICS currency. However, payment platforms that take into account the various currencies in the image of the M-bridge between China, ASEAN, and the Gulf Cooperation Council. This has shown its potential, and it can actually gradually eliminate the dollar from many of the international transactions. And India is very interested in that because they obviously from the beginning want the rupee to be part of it. Let's face it, the rupee was the major currency in the Middle East and East Africa for centuries. So they feel that they do not want, of course, to have the dollar replaced by the yuan, but electronic and blockchain platforms for payment in reciprocal payments in each of the nation's currencies is taking shape. And with the entry of giants like Indonesia and Nigeria and others into the BRICS bloc gradually, you are going to see more and more of that taking place. I think the decline of the dollar is inevitable. And that may indeed be the main risk, because it could lead the US to try a confrontation, to start a war, to try to prevent that, because Trump has been very adamant that we cannot tolerate this, we will go against these countries, but I don't think he can actually do very much about it. And in fact, many of his policies are helping unwillingly and unwittingly the alternative to the dollar to rise. So I think this is a matter now, the momentum is increasing. So I think we have seen the last 10 years were pretty slow as far as this concept evolving, but we're going to see a much faster evolution towards an alternative payment system. And the fact that increasingly the SWIFT is being replaced, and that now we have systems that work that are one fraction of the time used by SWIFT for transfers, and practically free in terms of cost. So that you cannot stop such a system. Technologies have the answer. And by the way, I will end with a very brief statement quoting Walter Russell Mead, whom you certainly know about. He was here recently, so we had another conversation with him, and he made a very witty observation. He said, if you look at what's happening in America, what you have effectively is an alliance between the Silicon Valley and MAGA. Why? Because both of them want to get rid of the bureaucratic state and replace it by something else. In the case of MAGA, it's free enterprise and individualism. In the case of the Silicon Valley, it is high technology, AI and quantum computing. So that's where you get this kind of strange convergence between people like Elon Musk and some of the MAGA base. I don't know how long that will last, because now we see that there is already a bit of a divorce taking place. But anyway, that's where I leave it.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate both of your assessments so much. And I mean, there's so much to unpack, so many threads that we have just begun to pull on. And of course, there's many contradictions and interesting anomalies in the system, many very negative, dangerous influences that too few people pay attention to. I personally am very, very concerned about the convergence of various transhumanist Silicon Valley types who have their own dystopic view of how the world should be run, along with the Theo Bros networks that have also exerted a huge amount of influence and destruction as far as promoting crusader-type policies abroad, which are trying to co-opt the energy of the legitimate patriotic base in America that doesn't want wars, that wants to work with their neighbors and wants just peace, prosperity, jobs to feed their families. That's what the vast majority want. And then there's these disturbing manipulations of these sentiments, including in Europe and in Canada here where I live. So definitely I appreciate just being able to map out some of the terrain, look and just view with a constructive solution-oriented mindset towards the future. So for that, both gentlemen, I thank you so much for joining us. I thank all of the audience for joining us. And keep in mind, this is a small channel, it's a new channel, but we really want to grow it. So I'd request that people subscribe, like this video, and get the word out to your network that this happens every 2 weeks on Sundays at 11 a.m. New York time. And let's build this thing up, because we definitely need these types of conversations to be much more rampant and normalized. So again, thank you both. And for last thing, to buy Caleb's books, of which there are many, to go to his website to support the political Center for Political Innovation. Go to the website under his face right there on the screen, or in the description box under this video. Carpentier, your world affairs journal of international issues is really important. The link to your website with all of that material is going to be down also in the description box. I highly recommend people follow that stuff. Thank you both. Until next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.